There are some conversations that cause us to think, yes, of course, this is why the world is as it is. And for me, the chat I had with Will Storr about his book, The Status Game, on human life and how to play it, is one of those conversations. I can't stop thinking about it. The premise is simple. Life is a game, Will writes.
We play for status, if only subtly. With every social interaction, every contribution we make to work, love, or family life, and every internet post. We play with how we dress, how we speak, and what we believe. We play with our lives, with the story we tell of our past, and our dreams and plans for the future. Life is not a journey towards a perfect destination. It's a game that never ends.
This idea keeps popping up in my mind, saying, yes, this is yet another example of our innate human desire for status. That's the thought I had when I read Jonathan Haidt's viral new book, The Anxious Generation, about how our children and teenagers today respond to the digital world. Status games are everywhere, in the obsession boys have with winning video games, to the tireless desire for social affirmation that plagues so many girls. Next week, we will be releasing my conversation with Jonathan in 2 parts. It's a good one. Essential listening for parents and highly relevant, I think, to all of us who navigate the digital world. Until then, you might consider this conversation with Will to be your homework. I, for one, am looking forward to hearing it again.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And this is The Next Big Idea. Today, life is a game.
A game of status.
Whether you like it or not. I'm joined in the virtual studio today by my producer, Caleb Bissinger.
Well, I'm always here. I just don't always have my microphone turned on.
That's right. But I asked you to leave it on today because the two of us cannot stop talking about the book that today's episode is all about. It's really impacted my thinking, Caleb, and I think it may have also impacted you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So on the show today, Rufus is going to be speaking with a brilliant British writer named Will Storr. And we've been following Will's work for a while now. I think, Rufus, you read his book Selfie, which is all about why we're so hopelessly narcissistic. Mm-hmm. I'm obsessed with this book he published in 2019 called The Science of Storytelling, which is, I don't think an exaggeration to say, the best book I've ever read about writing, and I have read a lot of them. And Will is something of a star over in the UK. He hits bestseller lists. The Times of London called him one of the best journalists of ideas. But he's not quite as well known in the US.
I think that could change, Caleb, thanks to his new book, The Status Game, On Human Life and How to Play It, which I read with relish. His thesis is that our brains were, quote, designed by evolution to seek connection and rank, to be accepted into groups and win status within them. This is the game of human life.
And you can't not play that game, right?
That's the tricky part. It's involuntary. We are all constantly measuring our status and trying to increase it. Will says the only feasible way to opt out is to seek an empty room and stay in it. And frankly, I'm not even sure that would work. You cannot escape the status game. You can't win it either, because the more status you get, the more you want and the more you have to lose.
And I think we should pause and say, some listeners may be thinking, hold on a second, Rufus, that can't be true because I don't care about status. I'm not obsessed with fame or fortune. So maybe you can explain what exactly Will means by status, because I think it's not just about money or celebrity, is it?
Absolutely right, Caleb. That's a really important distinction. The way Will defines it, status isn't exclusively about money or celebrity. It's about feeling valued. It's about being taken seriously. And we've come up with an infinite variety of games where we compete to achieve that sense of self-satisfaction.
And here's how those games work. you get a group of people together, they agree on what symbols they're going to use to mean status, and then they strive to capture as many of those status symbols as they can, more than any other player. So, money is a status symbol. Power is a status symbol. Where you went to college is a status symbol. What kind of music you like, where you buy your groceries, the size of your carbon footprint, how often you meditate. These are all status symbols, and we can play games with all of them.
They are everywhere, and it's easy to get discouraged when you start seeing it. You realize how many status games you're playing and how many of them are, frankly, kind of silly, kind of ridiculous. Mm-hmm. You know you shouldn't care about them, and yet you do because you just can't help yourself.
So in the lead up to this interview, Rufus, we had a really interesting conversation, the two of us, about a particular status game that you found yourself playing kind of unwittingly back in your 20s. And I wonder if you would be comfortable maybe to share a little bit about that, because I think it's really compelling and relatable.
And a little bit embarrassing, but I'll share it nonetheless. So yes, when I was in my 20s, a few good friends of mine started to publish their first books. And I attended their book launch parties. I was happy for them. I was proud of them, but I was physically unable to read their books. I intended to. I kept saying, next week, I'm going to crack the book. But I could not physically bring myself to do it, to read their books.
And why do you think? Like, what was holding you back?
Well, that's what's interesting. I don't know that I could have answered that question at the time, but I can answer it now. I think I couldn't read their books because I wanted to write books myself, and their accomplishments made me feel inadequate, frankly. Now, I should say, in case any of those friends are listening, you know who you are, that by my mid-30s, I was over this condition. I delighted in my friends' books. I read them cover to cover. But to be honest, Caleb, I've always been embarrassed by this block because I knew how petty it was. I knew it reflected poorly on me. And I'm only able to share this now because Will's book helped me put a name to the forces that were at work. It was all about status.
And when you say that you got over it, do you think it was that your inability to read your friends' books? I mean, do you think it was that you just grew up? Or do you think it was that you kind of said to yourself, like, oh, well, you know what? I'm not winning the who's written the most books game, but I'm doing pretty well in other status games. So that basically your status rose and that sort of compensated for this lack of status in the publishing game, and that allowed you to sort of get over the hump.
Boy, you're really not going to let me take any credit for becoming wiser and more enlightened. And I think I think the point is well taken, because I would like to say that I just became more mature, wiser, more confident. But I think certainly something else was going on. I used to joke that I'm starting a new company in order not to write a novel, and the plan is working perfectly. And I think it's possible that my status was rising in other games I was playing. I was building some companies, and so I didn't feel as threatened. But something I learned from Will's book, which I have to say made me feel a little bit better about myself, is that the small, ungenerous response I had to my friend's success was deeply human. Will cites this study that found that when people read about someone popular, rich, and smart, the pain center of their brain flares up. I love this. And when they read that that person suffered a setback, their pleasure system lights up.
It's just incredible. It reminds me of that the Gore Vidal quote, whenever a friend succeeds, a little something in me dies.
Totally. I love that quote. I hate to think the rise of my friend's status caused me pain, that something in me died, but it does seem to be a very human response. You know, something else I'll say about Will's book that was sort of counterintuitive is that it's helped me feel a little bit better about humanity, actually. I don't know about you, but I found humans, my fellow humans, to be kind of frustrating in recent years.
Sure.
Why are we so righteous, so stubborn, so fervent in our views, whether or not they're correct? And looking at our behavior through the lens of status, as well as my own behavior, has been clarifying for me. And while we can't opt out of the status game, we can control which games we choose to play and how we play them.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. Okay, so let's take a quick break, and then we'll hear your interview with Will Storr. And then at the end, you and I can come back and chat for a minute about some of our takeaways.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by SAP. SAP Business AI. Embedded across SAP solutions, it drives immediate impact. From Joule, your digital assistant, to AI-powered capabilities portfolio-wide, make confident decisions using your own data. SAP Business AI. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
Hey, I'm Gianna Prudenti.
And I'm Jermaine Jackson Gadsden. We're the hosts of Let's Talk Offline from LinkedIn News and iHeart Podcasts.
There's a lot to figure out when you're just starting your career. That's where we come in.
Think of us as your work besties you can turn to for advice.
And if we don't know the answer, we bring in people who do, like negotiation expert Maury Taheri-Poor.
If you start thinking about negotiations as just a conversation, then I think it sort of eases us a little bit.
Listen to Let's Talk Offline on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Will Storr, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rufus.
You may not realize this, Will, but you have an uncanny knack for writing the books that I've been looking for. I have been thinking for years about like the neuroscience of stories, because it's always struck me that like stories seem to have this kind of be this magical key to the human mind, to how we persuade people, to how we're deluded. And then I find that you've written a brilliant book about this.
Thank you.
And then meanwhile, I've been fascinated for years and years by status. I've always suspected that this was something that was hardwired. And then we have sort of all the different ways that we measure status in different societies. And now you've written a book about this. So this is so thank you for reading my mind and writing books on such fascinating topics.
Well, thanks for reading them, and I'm glad you enjoyed them.
Well, here, Will, are the opening words of your book. Life is a game. There's no way to understand the human world without first understanding this. Everyone alive is playing a game whose hidden rules are built into us and that silently direct our thoughts, beliefs, and actions. This game is inside us. It is us. And this game, of course, is the status game. So do you see status as the essential human motivator? Is this kind of a unified field theory of human behavior that everything boils down to status?
No. I don't think everything boils down to status, but I think a lot does. Psychologists often talk about getting along and getting ahead, so belongingness and status. So we want to feel loved, but also admired. And, I do write a bit about the belongingness in the book because, part of it's about status games, and part of playing a game is you've got to be accepted into the group. But mostly this is about the second, the getting ahead part. So, yeah, it's not like a theory of everything in the sense that everything boils down to status. But it certainly is. It's a theory of a lot, because I think a hell of a lot does.
Well, I think it may be useful for listeners to define what we mean by status. People immediately think of kind of fame and money, but those are maybe just some flavors of status. How do you define it?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that when you say, oh, everybody's motivated by status, what they hear when you say that is, oh, everybody wants to be famous, everybody wants to be rich. That isn't what it is. I mean, fame and money are two ways you can measure status, but there are infinite ways you can measure, status. Like somebody playing a kind of an ascetic kind of monk-based status game will measure their status on how little they can get on with, and how little they can eat, and how simply they can live. So it's much more complex than saying it's simply about the pursuit of fame and money. Fundamentally, it's about feeling valued. We want to feel valued by our group. That's what status is. And that's for very good evolutionary, reasons. We spend most of our time evolving the human condition in the context of hunter-gatherer groups, of, highly cooperative groups. And so they had to develop a system of incentive and reward to kind of goad us into being useful members of that group. And so this is what that system of reward is. It's that when we proved ourselves valuable to that hunter-gatherer group, either with acts of great competence or by being a kind of virtuous, selfless person, we were rewarded with status. And so we've evolved this kind of fundamental basic rule of life, which is be of value. And if you are perceived to be of value, then you will be rewarded with status.
Where did this need for status come from? Why are we so obsessed with it?
Well, as I say, I mean, it's actually, it's older than the human condition, but sticking with with humanity,
Yeah.
as I said before, it all goes back to the hunter-gatherer tribe. Human beings are lots of things, and one of the things we are often quite selfish and self-interested. So there has to be a system of rewards such that kind of rewards people who are of value to the group. Otherwise, people wouldn't bother being of value to the group. And so what you find when you look at hunter-gatherer groups, both of the kinds we evolved in and the kinds of pre-modern groups that still exist today, you find that they are have a hierarchy, and that the more status that you earn within those groups, the better everything gets. So the more food you get, the better quality food you get, the safer your sleeping sites, the better the conditions of life for your children, the greater access to your choice of mates. So all of that stuff plugs directly into survival and reproduction. And of course, survival and reproduction being the most kind of fundamental, urges that living things have. And for humans, the more status you get, the better your ability to survive and reproduce. So it's that fundamental. It's absolutely plugged into, the very basis of our, motivations in life.
And the research bears this out. I think you cite a meta-study of 186 pre-modern societies around the world that show that consistently men of higher status invariably had greater wealth and more wives and provided better nourishment for their children. One can see why some aspects of status that seem, today it might be how many likes you have on a post or something, right?
Yeah.
And that can seem trivial. But we evolved to have this kind of obsession with status. The argument would be in an environment within which this actually resulted in a higher probability of surviving, procreating, and flourishing.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I mean, we've evolved to crave status. We haven't evolved to crave money or likes. We've evolved to crave status. But what the kind of, human life adds is, we have infinite ways of playing status games, and there are infinite ways you can mark your status, and we're so obsessed with it, we'll create any kind of game you can imagine, and social media is just the latest form of human status game.
This claim that our obsession with status, with increasing our status, with constantly measuring our status in all these subtle ways, we'll get into some of this research, it's kind of amazing, is, I think, a controversial claim that upsets some people. There's a kind of dark and some might say cynical or tragic element to this, right? Which is that the status game is a zero-sum game by definition. Not everyone can be high status, right? There have to be losers in the status game. It's a relative, status is relative. And as humanists and as optimists, we don't want to believe that there's like a sorting mechanism for human beings that's a zero-sum game. And like as Harari put it in *Sapiens*, he said, the story we tell ourselves that everybody is equal is a fiction. And if status is hardwired, there's no avoiding the idea that they're winners and losers, and there always will be. Do you see this as threatening to the liberal egalitarian dream?
It's a disaster to the egalitarian dream because it says it's an impossibility, and we know it's an impossibility not simply because of just the enormous amount of scientific research there is in how the brain works from all kinds of angles, from neuroscience, from evolutionary psychology, from social psychology. I mean, God, you put 4 people in a room together, complete strangers, and let them just chat for half an hour, and then by the end of that half an hour, a rough hierarchy will have asserted itself with the with the highest status person on top and the hierarchy moving down. Like, we can't stop doing it. It's wired in, and and the final chapter of the status game looks at the communism, because I think the ultimate proof of this really is the communist experiment, because it was this enormous experiment. Communism was all about, okay, let's create a world in which there's no status, in which everybody is equal. So, I mentioned before about psychologists say getting along and getting ahead. We're going to get rid of the getting ahead part. It's all going to be getting along. So the early purist communists, there even talks about sharing wives, and husbands and there being no family. So pure egalitarianism. And of course, it just didn't work. What actually happened was that you just got a different kind of hierarchy with the people who identified as peasants at the top, and the people who used to be kind of part of the bourgeoisie middle classes at the bottom, who got discriminated against and kicked about and treated, tortured and killed and treated appallingly. In the book, I talk about this sociologist that went to the Soviet Union in the 50s and found 12 distinct social classes, which is more than we had in England at the time. This notoriously class-bound society. And it all goes down to this fundamental mistake that Marx and Engels and the early communist thinkers made. And the mistake was this, that they said, well, where does the status desire come from? Well, it comes from inequality. So, if I have a house and I'm proud of my house, but somebody comes and builds a house next door to me that's bigger, I suddenly won't be happy with my house. So let's just get rid of private property completely and make everybody's house an equal size. Well, that's fine, but it's a mistake. The mistake they made was thinking the status urge comes from inequality and private ownership. It doesn't. It's in our brains. It's wired in, so you cannot eradicate it. And the communist experiment kind of proves that. Everything from the crazy level of kind of class stratification it had in the Soviet Union to the cult of personality that surrounded Stalin and the communist leaders. I mean, geez, you want to see status. Look at the way that people behaved around Stalin whilst he was still alive.
Well, I know from having conversations with friends on this about your wonderful book in the last couple of weeks that it's going to be a process to convince listeners that this is true, that status is hardwired, because it really violates something sacred that we'd like to believe about our potential as humans, right? I think there is a lot of great news and very useful conclusions we can come to once we're convinced that status is innate. But I feel like it's going to require trotting out some more of the evidence in your extraordinary book that convinced me 311 pages later that this was true. But I want to also establish first that the stakes of status and how it impacts people are very high. You talk about the impact on health, right?
Yeah.
And this study on the British civil service and health outcomes. You want to share that?
Yeah, so this is a famous set of studies called the Whitehall studies by Dr. Michael Marmot. And the Whitehall is the British civil service, so it's an incredibly enormous organization, hugely stratified. And what Marmot and his team discovered was that the lower you drop down the status hierarchy of Whitehall, the worse your health outcomes become and the higher your mortality. Now, the first thing you're going to think is, oh, well, that's obvious. It's because rich people, they get to afford to shop at Whole Foods, and they get the personal trainer. They're less likely to smoke. But that's not what they found. They found like a wealthy smoker, just one rung below the very top, was more likely to fall ill as a result of their smoking than the person above them. They also found this, separate set of academics found this in baboons. So they did a test where they had baboons in a laboratory, and these unlucky stroke lucky baboons were given a really unhealthy diet of junk food to live on for a while. So they developed sort of unhealthy bodies and high levels of atherosclerotic plaque. And they found, just like in Whitehall, that they were all equally unhealthy, but it was the baboons towards the bottom of the hierarchy that were more likely to fall ill as a result of their bad diets than the one at the top. And then crucially, I don't know how they did this, but they conspired to rearrange the hierarchy of the baboon troop, and they found that the health outcomes changed in lockstep with the rearrangement of the hierarchy. So the new top baboons were suddenly healthier and had better outcomes than baboons beneath them. So it even sinks down to our physical health, this status stuff, and it's our happiness. I mean, one of the major studies that I quote in the book, and actually the study that made me want to write the book, was this one that looked at 60,000 people across 123 countries, and they found that people's well-being consistently depended upon the degree to which they felt respected by other people, and that status was the strongest predictor of long-term positive or negative feelings. So that's stronger than money. That's so status is more important to people's happiness than family, money, and all those other things. So that was extraordinary to me, and the fact that they found this across gender, culture, age, personality, wherever they looked, all around the world, they found that this was true.
This fascinated me when I first read it, because I wondered, well, why would lower status negatively impact health, negatively impact longevity? And you explain When we're not doing well in the game of life, our bodies prepare for crisis by switching our settings so we're ready for attack. It increases inflammation, which helps the healing of any physical wounds. So it's basically a kind of crisis response, right? Like when we feel low status in our peer group, in our environment, our bodies are preparing for possible physical violence or negative outcomes. And unfortunately, that same inflammation has the impact of causing cancer and having really negative long-term health outcomes.
Yes, exactly. So inflammation was designed for the short term, like when we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, in the old environment. So we're not supposed to be inflamed for very long. We mentioned before the other important thing, which is belongingness. And it's the same with belongingness. I think more famously, loneliness is also very bad for your health for the same reason. So when the subconscious brain detects that we are isolated, we have a deprivation in connection, or we're relatively low status, it's the same thing that the brain will go, okay, things are bad. This is a period of risk. I need to change my settings such that inflammation goes up and antiviral response goes down.
There are all these times in our everyday lives when status plays a role in these kinds of subtle ways, because as you say, our status detection system is constantly working in the background, constantly noticing, how much eye contact we're receiving from other people, or in one study, how much orange juice is being allocated to different people, right? And this rang true to me. You want to talk about the orange juice and the eye contact? I found that extraordinary.
Yeah. So neuroscientists talk about that's their phrase, the status detection system. So it's always on. We're always measuring it. Because the thing about status is not like money. Like you can't collect your status in a box and show everybody, look at my status, look at my status. Status is offered to you by other people. So even Kanye West and Kim Kardashian and Paul McCartney and Meghan Markle get chippy about status because it's always in flux, it's always in question, and it can always be kind of withdrawn. So I love the orange juice study too, because it was one of those ones that felt ridiculous but also completely true, and it's this idea that if you pour a group of people measures of orange juice, but one person gets a little bit less orange juice than everybody else, that person will become preoccupied and obsessed about why have I got less orange juice? And of course, they're not upset because they got one mouthful less of orange juice. They've got upset because their brain's status detection system read that as I've been judged as of being less value to all these other people. So that was just one of the kind of studies I thought was. It just felt like it captured something essential about the human condition.
I'm always aware of this when I'm sitting with a group of people, that the eye contact and the allocation of eye contact seems to be a pretty good indication of how that person, say the person speaking, reads the status of all the other people that they're sitting with, right? And so in some cases it can be uncomfortable. Like you'll have a situation where you're focusing on someone because you think they're the decision maker in a business setting. And you later learn it was somebody else who was the decision maker, and because of the unequal eye contact, you basically communicated a lack of respect to the other person. I'm sometimes made uncomfortable by a situation where somebody's looking at me disproportionately, and I'm trying to signal to them to look at other people. But it does strike me as being like something that people are subconsciously highly aware of, but often not fully consciously aware of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I noticed it with my wife. I mean, we've been together for 20 years, and when we met, I'm slightly older, so I was slightly ahead in my career. And there was this extraordinarily obvious point where she became an editor of a magazine. And as soon as she became an editor in social occasions, I suddenly noticed that I wasn't getting it anymore. And it was just really interesting to me how not only how I really noticed that, and I started to be sort of ignored at parties when I was with my wife, because she was a magazine editor, which is perceived as in media circles in which I was sort of traveling. She was perceived as being higher status than me, and it was a really sudden. I mean, I remember the night it happened, it was like, oh God, that was really weird. And it was, I was self-aware enough to kind of chuckle a bit at it, but it was very noticeable.
And now you've just accepted your lower status with next to your
It's
wife.
kind of odd because it depends. It depends on where we are. Sometimes if it's a books crowd,
right,
get used to not getting any eye contact. But if it's a magazine kind of fashion crowd, it's the other way around. So yeah,
it's so interesting. So I was fascinated to read that our status detection system registers facial markers for dominance or submission in 43 milliseconds.
Yeah.
Because I would say that high status people tend to speak more often and more loudly. They're perceived to be more facially expressive. They achieve more successful interruptions in conversation. They touch themselves less. They use more relaxed, open postures. And this surprised me, use more filled pauses such as and ah, and have a steadier vocal tone. So I thought we're not supposed to and ah, but apparently that's a sign of being higher status.
Well, apparently so. That's what they say. Yeah, I was quite surprised by that one too. But I guess there's a limit to the ums and ahs that you're allowed. I mean, the other one they said is that very prestigious, high status people are much more self-deprecating. They kind of laugh and joke more.
Right.
I thought that was that was really interesting.
One place where I find the status game to be highly comical is on airlines. So I had the good fortune when I was, spending more time traveling for business, sometimes ending up in first class, like at the front of the bus, right? But I've spent, let me say, Will, most of my time in the back of the bus, right? In coach. And I just find our rituals around air travel to be just hysterical because, first we sort of trot out the first class passengers. Everybody, the crowds part and the first class passengers sort of march forward with kind of aloof, looking happy with themselves. Then we parade all the coach passengers past the first class passengers who are now reclined in their thrones, like slowly, languorously turning the pages of high status magazines or whatever they're doing. Then we draw the curtains closed, and a few hours later, we release the smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies into the airplane that only the first class people will receive. And I mean, so much of it is and now there are like 6 different levels of boarding groups, and you can pay an extra $25 to board a little bit earlier, and people are very eager to line up and get in their cramped seat 5 minutes earlier. And it just always struck me as just very funny display of how we parade these sort of small distinctions in status.
I was flown. Somebody flew me recently in business class, which was very nice. Coming back from Singapore, and it was these days obviously they have those flat beds in business class, and I was just sort of getting tucked on my flat bed. It was lovely, and it occurred to me like I'd loved it. I was so comfortable, and I'm in business class. It's so nice, and then it occurred to me that actually by all usual measures, it was a terrible situation. I was basically in a dormitory. Full of, 32 complete strangers. My socked feet were inches away from a complete stranger's socked feet. I could see his television in my field of vision. So by any other standard, if you were to say, "Oh, hi, Will, this is where we're sleeping tonight," and I was on land, I'd be like, I am not sleeping in this dormitory. I'm not a student anymore. And yet I was delighted. And the thing was, even though I realized actually this is horrific, it didn't make any difference. I still enjoyed it. I still loved it. It was so weird.
Right.
And it's all about, it's got to be all about the status, isn't it? Because it's even business class on a flight is, it's not rough. I don't want to say it's rough, but do you know what I mean? You feel like it's palatial. But it isn't palatial. It's a dormitory,
Well, and meanwhile, there's some extraordinary examples of how status and status games play themselves out in other parts of the world. Can we talk about yams?
Oh, yeah, we can talk about yams. Yeah. Shall I explain the yams?
I wish you would. Yeah, I just love the story. It's amazing.
So this is a really interesting anthropological study of a group down in the Micronesian island of Pompeii. And I just thought this was a really great example of how status manifests in human groups. So in Pompeii, life is like it is in most places, which is very stratified. And it's very hard for people to there's not much social mobility in Pompeii. But there is one way that you can, rise through the ranks of status. And that's if there are these biannual chiefly feasts. And the man who brings the largest yam to that feast is publicly declared number one. They're literally declared number one. And they're celebrated by the entire community. So what's happened on Pompeii is that, naturally enough, the men of the island have become absolutely obsessed with growing massive yams. They will grow them in secret plots in the woodland far away from their house and creep out of their house at like 2 or 3 in the morning to tend to them. This kind of very complex system of moral kind of etiquette has bloomed up around the yam growing. So it's taboo to look at another man's yams because it's like you're taking their yam growing secrets. And it's so taboo that even the yams you're going next to your house, which are for eating, they're little yams, you're not even allowed to look at those. And even that is now seen as taboo. So they're obsessed with massive yams on Pompeii. But what I thought was especially interesting was, speaks to the value of status and actually the kind of functional, wonderful role that the status pursuit plays in human life, was that the islanders of Pompeii have become absolutely incredible at growing massive yams. So the yams are so big over there that they have to construct special stretchers to carry them into the feast. And you've got like multiple, I think 6 men carrying one yam into the feast. So that to me spoke of just how crazy, we become over the things that we decide signal status, but also how fantastically brilliant we are, when we focus our minds on it at, creating value to justify our claim to status.
Right, exactly. I mean, how do you grow yams that large? I don't know what kind of optimization of fertilizers or crossbreeding or what's going on. And what's extraordinary is these, 80-pound, however large these yams are, probably don't taste that good, right? They're probably relatively bland. Like this is not optimizing for taste at all, right?
I had that same thought. It's like a big tomato. It doesn't taste good. It's like powdery right. And I bet they taste horrible. but they've decided that this signals status, and so they go for it.
You can't even look at another man's yams, but you can think about them and you can compare yours. But what's extraordinary about this is, again, it's another example of how the currency of status, the way that we measure it, can be very, very different. It might be Facebook likes, it might be money, it might be your car, it might be your Amazon sales ranking for your book, or it might be the size of your yams. Like this is totally fungible, the way that we measure status. And yet, in every corner of the world, we find status obsession, even when people go to great lengths to express a lack of interest in status, right? This really, to me, drove the point home, right? That when people spend years learning to meditate with the express purpose of overcoming any investment in ego, there's still no escaping it. Do you want to share that? I think this was studied in the Netherlands, right? Yeah.
There was this great study in the Netherlands where they found 3,700 people who practiced mindfulness meditation specifically to reduce attachment to ego needs such as social approval and success. And they found that these people scored very high in what they described as spiritual superiority. Surprise, surprise, these people who discovered this thing and practiced hard at mindfulness meditation and got really good at it started to think quite well of themselves and actually started looking down their nose slightly at people who didn't have the amazing insights into the human condition they had. And I love that study because it's like the orange juice one. It just felt like it really had captured something about the human condition because it was like, of course, that's what they think. Like you can't, of course, that's what they think.
Right.
Because that's what people are like.
Tired of AI hype without results? SAP Business AI isn't just talk. It's embedded across SAP solutions, driving immediate impact for your organization. From Joule, your digital assistant, to AI-powered capabilities throughout the SAP portfolio, SAP Business AI helps you make confident decisions based on your own data, all while maintaining the highest security and privacy standards for growth-focused businesses. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
I now think, Will, that we may have persuaded more of our listeners that status is in fact innate. Our obsession with status, our attention to status, our desire to earn more status. But the last place where my mind might have gone is these examples of egalitarian tribes. And we had, you may know of David Wengrow and the late David Graeber, who wrote a wonderful book called The Dawn of Everything, about a closer look at human prehistory and examples of more egalitarian living. And so obviously we are capable as a species of living in more egalitarian ways. However, as it turns out, that takes an enormous amount of policing. Right, or it's not an easy thing to achieve. Hey, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to describe them not as egalitarian, but more egalitarian. And I think that's the key. Mm-hmm. They are more egalitarian because they don't have things like, private possessions and so much and land and all that stuff. So big status differentials aren't allowed to accrue, but they remain relatively egalitarian because there's enormous level of policing of each other's status, and that level of policing happens because everybody is extremely chippy about their own status. Everybody is determined that nobody will play the big man or the big woman and come strutting in, dominating the group. So that egalitarian appearance in pre-modern groups is a direct result of everybody being very, 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 very interested in the level of each other's status and making sure that nobody grabs too much of it.
Right. I think we can say that there are maybe ways of playing the status game that are kinder to a larger number of people and leave everybody feeling more connected. And maybe that's a positive, right? So you can have sort of a diversification of different types of status games. So you might have in a given community, as you point out many times in the book, so-and-so is great at finding tubers. Sammy over here is great at finding honey. And that's great. We love having Sam around to find the honey, right? And then so-and-so is a great hunter, right? And we can have this distribution of different strengths that give everyone a kind of high status for their specific skills they bring to bear. But still, if anyone gets kind of overly happy with themselves and overly cocky because they've just dragged a stag to the village or what have you, the whole community will surround them and sing a song of derision, if necessary, to put them back in their place, right?
That's right. That's an Inuit tribe. They do that. They surround them and sing a song of derision in their face. And I think the key thing is in human groups, generally speaking, status is given by other people. So it's okay for us to say, man, you did some really great tuber finding today. I really appreciate that. That's wonderful. Yeah. But we don't like people who kind of strut in and going, I'm the king of the tuber finders. That upsets people. Because status is given by the group. It's a reward serviced by the group.
Interesting. Right. And I think we can also say that there are different types of different types of status games we play. You talk about 3 in particular, and maybe some of them are healthier than others.
Yeah, so there's 3 kinds of different status game that we can play. There's the dominance game. So dominance we've been using since before we were human, and dominance is basically violence, but also the threat of violence, and not just physical violence, but also social violence. So ostracization, bullying, humiliation, all of those things. So people can play dominant status games. Like Putin is playing a game of dominance over Ukraine at the moment. Quite clearly, and Zelensky's is pushing back with dominance, and that's war. It's also mafias, it's also a boxing match. So those are dominance games. But then when we settled down and became characteristically human, and we started living in cooperative groups, dominance wasn't very good as a way of getting on in life because, you can't just go around beating everybody up and threatening people all the time. So we evolved these kind of prestige forms of status, and 2 main ones. One is, we already talked about a success game, so competence. Mm-hmm. You can be valuable to your group being a great sorcerer, a great honey finder, a great storyteller, and so on. When you show value to your group being very good at stuff, you get rewarded with status. But the other one is virtue. So there's another form of status game, which is the virtue game, and that's all about following the rules, knowing the rules, enforcing the rules, believing the sacred beliefs. So you can think about a church, like a religion is a virtue game. The British royal family is a virtue game. It's not about competence of the royal family. It's not about dominance anymore. It's about virtue.
Yeah.
It's about believing, accepting that King Charles really is a wonderful person and following all the rules. I mean, the royal family is all about rules, saying the right thing, bowing in the right way, all of that stuff. So that's a classic virtue game. And you can see, you know, Elon Musk or Kanye West are superstars of success games. But Michelle Obama and the Pope are superstars of virtue games.
And so one would think at first blush that playing virtue status games would be better than the others. But I think you say that often virtue status games can be among the most pernicious.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with virtue is that it's always local to your group. It's always local to the game that you're playing. So every status game has its own particular idea of what is virtuous and what isn't. So, you know, the easiest way to explain it is just to say that Hitler thought he was a good, virtuous man. He thought he was ridding the world of the Jews was a virtuous thing because he genuinely believed the hideous anti-Semitic, you know, lie of inherent Jewish evil and conniving. You know, Lenin and Stalin, for all their kind of violence and insanity, thought they were virtuous people because they were spearheading the communist project, which was all about community and sharing and, you know, was utopian. It wanted to create this paradise on earth. So, and the problem with virtue is that it does this kind of evil thing where it says, because my game and my rules are virtuous, anyone that rivals me is against virtue, and that gives me permission to hate, attack, and destroy them. And so you see that time and time again. You know, most obviously in the current years on social media, where people who play virtue games on social media very often mix that virtue play with elements of dominance and you know, go on the attack and trying to destroy people's reputations and jobs and so on, all in the name of their own game's definition of virtue.
Well, and social networks have made it that much more dangerous, right? I mean, social networks have just been status game accelerators, right? I mean, this has just been enabling this kind of core instinct of ours.
Absolutely. I mean, and that to me that's why social media is an extraordinary thing because it's become instantly, globally, enormously successful. I mean, the latest figures are that more than half the world use social media, more than 4 billion people use social media. And when you think of the amount of people in the world who don't have phones and who are too young to use social media, still it's 4 billion. So why has it become so instantly and globally, cross-culturally successful? Well, I think because it's a brand new way that we can earn status. The social media is dominance, virtue, and success. It's people pushing each other around. It's people signaling their beliefs and their virtuous, their claims to virtue-based status, but also they're signaling their success. You know, look at LinkedIn, look at people's holidays on Instagram. You know, when I'm posting book reviews on Twitter, that's all claims to, when I tweet our conversation on my social media, that's going to be a, hey guys, look, I was on this great podcast, you know, so that's what social media is. It's human life. It's dominance, virtue, and success. And it's become incredibly successful, incredibly powerful because it's a brand new way that we can play status games, and virtue is the easiest game of all to play. All you've got to do to have a bit of virtue status is fire up your social media platform, have a pop at somebody that you don't like, and all your followers will tell you you're wonderful. So it's extremely easy to earn a bit of virtue status on social media.
Well, maybe at your next cocktail party, when everybody's making eye contact with your wife, the famous magazine editor, some of them may have seen a social tweet about your extraordinary interview on the Next Big Idea podcast, so you'll get more eye contact with. That's always possible. But you know, I was fascinated by what you had to say about the role of gossip networks. And this notion that gossip is a mechanism through which we reallocate status. So interesting.
Yeah, so gossip is a fundamental human behavior. Around 65% of our conversational time is spent talking about other people, and that's for men and for women, contrary to the kind of slightly sexist idea that women gossip more than men. So and that's kind of what we're doing when we gossip is we're allocating or removing status. So the prestige games of virtue and success are we play with our reputation. We have a reputation for being successful. We have a reputation for being virtuous or otherwise. And historically, those reputations have lived or died in the ways that people are kind of gossiping about us. And you can kind of see the media as just the latest iteration of a tribal gossip network. And it's the same with social media. I mean, that's what, when people are talking about other people on social media, they are kind of very often assigning or removing status from that person.
Yeah. One comment in the book that really made an impact for me was I think you mentioned that anthropologist Robin Dunbar suggested that we evolved speech in order to gossip. And if that's true, if our ability to communicate emerged because we needed to reallocate status through gossip and enforce the rules of the tribe, that's suggests an even more central role to the status game in our evolution.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, this is the current dominant theory that we evolve language to stop gossip, because that's how the tribe remain functional. You can't have a system of punishment and reward that keeps the tribe functional without language. An earlier theory was that language evolved to help us coordinate in hunts and so on. But of course, animals, wolves can coordinate perfectly well in hunts without having sophisticated language. So it makes a lot of sense. And also the completely universal nature of gossip, the fact that it is universal, that it takes up around 65% of our conversational load, and also that children, almost as soon as they can talk, automatically start gossiping, start telling stories about brothers and sisters, and this person did this and that person did that, and it's wired into our human behavior.
And one outcome. So these gossip networks are, of course, powerful forces that can sometimes result in the humiliation of individuals. And you talk in the book about the danger of humiliation, which one researcher called the nuclear bomb of emotions. And this is interesting because, as you've noted, that if status is so essential to our happiness and our drives as humans, then a collapse of status is kind of a case study in what happens if status is removed from a human, right? And as it turns out, the results are pretty scary.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually as I was sort of thinking about this as a possible book and thinking, is it true what I'm going to be arguing? And when I hadn't really done anywhere near as much of the research that I've done now, I sort of gave myself a little test. I remember thinking, well, if you're going to argue status is so important, it must be pretty bad when it gets taken away from us. So let's look into, what happens. And so I came upon this paper called Humiliation and Its Consequences. And the psychologists who wrote that paper describe humiliation as not only the removal of status, but the removal of status that's so dramatic and complete that you are unable to claim status from that group at any point in the future. So you're basically cancelled, you're gone, you're kicked out. What they find is that humiliation is right there in the very, very worst of human behaviors. Everything from serial killers to incel spree killers to terrorists to honor killers, all the way up to genocide has humiliation absolutely kind of embedded into it. So that to me was the, beyond all this study says stuff. That was a thing that really convinced me personally that status was that important, just because it just seemed like this hideous evil thread that connected all these terrible behaviors together was the sudden and public removal of status.
I mean, you look into some specific cases of like the Unabomber and others, and consistently it tends to be a case of the collapse of status and individuals not feeling valued by their community. And the only thing they can think to do to some degree is to take this just crushing sense of shame and convert it into pride, even if it's has horrendous repercussions.
Yeah, and what I found was that, the most evil acts tend to be by men because men are violent, much more violent than women. So that was kind of obvious. But what was less obvious was that, that they were humiliated, but also, crucially, they were quite narcissistic to start off with. So often these kind of, people who commit very evil acts are grandiose. So they, by their nature, already feel entitled to a high level of status. So when you take a very grandiose man who feels entitled to a high level of status and humiliate them again and again and again and again, you end up, very often with an extremely dangerous individual.
I was haunted by this proverb: the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. It's just haunting. Turning to the positive, Will, because there are some really positive conclusions that one can draw and that you share with readers in this book. First of all, for me, there's this incredibly useful and I think hopeful explanatory power of understanding a lot of what's been so confusing about our world in the last, many years, through this kind of corrective lens of understanding, our desire for status. And I think a lot of people that I know, and undoubtedly that and, have been feeling kind of confused and disheartened by the level of political polarity and just not understanding. Why am I no longer able to understand the behavior of large numbers of other humans? It's really disorienting. And I think for me, the story you tell of the young mother who became an anti-vaxxer was really helpful in trying to understand, because like if you're someone who believes your kids should be vaccinated and that all children should be, it's very hard to understand why you end up with this subculture that's so rapidly passionate about this position. And I think your explanation is very, very helpful.
Yeah, it was helpful to me to understand this stuff too. So there are certain status games that form around a belief. So religion is an obvious example. If an entry into the status game is simply a matter of, do you believe this thing? Do you believe that Jesus was the Son of God and rose again after 3 days? Yes, you do. Okay, you're in the Catholic game, or you're a Christian game. I think the fundamental thing to understand is that the human brain doesn't care that much about what's true. What it really cares about is, what do I have to believe in order to earn status in my community? And humans are capable of believing pretty much anything if they feel that their status is attached to it. And I think this is the fundamental kind of thing to understand about why these crazy beliefs come around. They come around, I would say, probably always in the context of a community, and that community is a status game. And entry into it is a matter of believing, but rising through that game is a matter of allowing that belief to kind of take you over, and you sort of, and you almost become, that belief becomes a parasite on your character and your behavior. And this woman, it was fascinating. So she was pregnant. She was 18. All her friends were at college, and she'd seen a documentary about home births and decided she wanted a home birth. But she has struggled to find a midwife that would give her a home birth, but she eventually did. And this woman came in, and she had, she had several children of her own, and she was this very strong, confident woman. And she said, I love, that's my thing. I love strong, confident women. I've grown up in a female household, so I really admired her. She was a successful mum. She was, somebody that I just naturally looked up to. And at the end of the first meeting, she said, have you considered not vaccinating your child? And she thought, well, that's a crazy thing to suggest. Why would I consider not vaccinating my child? What a mad thing to say. And she said, well, just Google it. You'll find some information on Google. So of course she Googled it and found all this sort of rotten information on Google about how vaccination is a conspiracy and so on. And she found a Facebook group called Great Moms Questioning Vaccines. And she kind of joined the group and announced herself as vaccine hesitant, was the phrase that she used. I think it's a common phrase in that world. And they immediately kind of, surrounded her on this group and beckoned her in. And again, she felt, oh my God, I'm surrounded by these amazing mums who are, doing what they can for the health of their children. And so she felt like she wanted to join that group. And of course, joining that group means believing. So she thought, well, I need to look into this more. she allowed herself to be convinced. And then the next thing she found herself doing was being out there in the world, proselytizing for the belief, arguing with her cousins, arguing with her doctor. And then she said, I would come back and I would go on and I'd just turn my computer on, open up Facebook, and immediately you'd be telling all the rest of the group what you'd done that day, and they'd reward you with status. And that's how it went. And I thought that was just so interesting how she perfectly described for me on the telephone how status game work without knowing anything about, the idea that I was kind of writing about in the book. I think that's how these communities that form around irrational beliefs very often happen.
You write about these cases with a certain amount of empathy for everybody involved, right? I mean, because there's a sense that like, hey, we are these organisms that are wired to crave status, to earn status. We can't help it. If we can't find it, we have to find another community or a way to earn status and feel valuable and feel good about ourselves. And a lot of the people who end up maybe on the wrong side of the truth, and in these cases doing some real harm, fully sincerely believe what they're saying and doing, but very much motivated by the affirmation they're receiving through these communities.
Yeah, I think that's the big piece of the jigsaw that people very often miss when they're busy judging other people for being stupid or whatever, or crazy or whatever it might be. My first book when I wrote when I was in my 20s was about ghosts and the people who believe in ghosts. And the book after that was about, intelligent people who believe crazy things. And the thing that struck me about meeting people like that was they sincerely believed what they were telling you. So, probably the most dramatic example in the book, The Heretics, was that I spent some time with this guy, David Irving, who was a very well-respected historian of the Second World War. He's spoken of admiringly in Slaughterhouse-Five. We know about Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden, because of David Irving's scholarship. And then at some point, I think in the 1980s, he decided that Hitler was a friend of the Jews and actually knew nothing about the Holocaust. And it was all a conspiracy by people beneath Hitler, and they kept it out of his knowledge. Now, this idea that David Irving has had has ruined his life. Not only has he been sort of excommunicated from the world of historians, he's been imprisoned. He was actually locked up in his 70s in Austria. And then when I met him, he was in permanent pain from a leg injury that he got in prison. He's ruined his life. And I think, yes, he's anti-Semitic. He's an unpleasant man by every measure. But I see his belief as a curse. We don't choose our beliefs like we choose, melons in the supermarket. Our beliefs kind of happen to us. It's a subconscious thing. And I think it's like with these QAnon people, a lot of them, we miss that they sincerely believe the things that they believe, as crazy it might seem. Mm-hmm. And that's because, the brain has, as I said before, it values what do I have to believe in order to earn status in my community much more than it values the truth.
Right. And this goes back to your prior book about the power of storytelling, that it is our nature to tell stories in which we are the hero, right? And this is sort of a core impulse that we have. The brain is more inclined to find ways to tell stories in which we are the hero than it is to discern the truth.
Yeah, that's right. So David Irving, the historian, is an anti-Semite, and his anti-Semitic beliefs are overpowered his powers of scholarship, and so. He came upon a story in which kind of Hitler was this kind of hero, and something subconscious in him decided to believe that, and it ended up kind of unraveling his entire life. So, I mean, with all my books, I try and remove that thing that we want to do of judging everybody through this moral lens of are they good or are they bad. I think things get much more interesting when you sort of take that away and just try and figure out what's going on with people. And I think that's true of the anti-vaxxers. I think it's true of, Holocaust deniers. They tend to have a particular instinctive worldview. And what the brain does is it comes upon a story that kind of flatters that worldview, that tells them that that worldview is true. And so, and that will be the story that they sincerely believe.
Hey, I'm Gianna Prudenti.
And I'm Janae Jackson Gadsden. We're the hosts of Let's Talk Offline, a new podcast from LinkedIn News and iHeart Podcasts.
When you're just starting out in your career, you have a lot of questions, like how do I speak up when I'm feeling overwhelmed?
Or, can I negotiate a higher salary if this is my first real job? Girl, yes.
Each week, we answer your unfiltered work questions.
Think of us as your work besties you can turn to for advice.
And if we don't know the answer, we bring in experts who do, like resume specialist Morgan Sanner.
The only difference between the person who doesn't get the job and the person who gets the job is usually who applies.
Yeah, I think a lot about that quote. What is it? Like, you miss 100% of the shots you never take?
Yeah, rejection is scary, but it's better than you rejecting yourself.
Together, we'll share what it really takes to thrive in the early years of your career,
without sacrificing your sanity or sleep.
Listen to Let's Talk Offline on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Will, in your journey writing this book, I'm sure you went through periods of feeling a little bit kind of discouraged by some of these human instincts and some of the ways they play out. But I think you also found some real silver linings in your exploration of our attraction to status. What are those silver linings?
One of the sort of most fundamental ones is that we have the human animal has evolved an automatic system of reward for people who are valuable. So when we're virtuous, when we're selfless, when we do something good, people automatically go, "Oh, that's really good. You did a great thing," and they give us a bit of status. I mean, it's even internal. When we give money to charity or do something that's good, even we feel, we get this little reward of, we feel better about ourselves. We reward ourselves with status internally. So the fact that we've evolved this, no other animal has this system of rewards for kind of virtuous behavior. And it's also true, with success. It was a bit of a weird realization that actually you think the virtue games are going to be the one that changes the world and makes the world a better place. But actually, it's been the success games. The world has become unimaginably better and fairer since the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution. And, what happened, the kind of weird thing that kind of set off the Scientific Revolution and then the Industrial Revolution was we started playing games in which status was awarded for the discovery of new and useful knowledge. So for the first time in human history, actual truth was what we were wanting, not like a religious story or a story about monarchy or whatever crazy stuff that our ancestors pre-17 whatever believed. Suddenly, actual useful truth was a way that we could earn status, and that was the culture of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. In the UK, it was alive with these status games. With people were tinkering in sheds, inventing this, inventing that. The UK was the Silicon Valley of its era, and then it spreads through Western Europe. It's America obviously now has overtaken Western Europe in terms of its practice of success games, but it's these success games that have lifted billions of people out of poverty. It's these success games that have invented vaccines that have saved the lives and prevented the deaths of billions of people. It's these success games that have figured out how cholera spreads, and so on and so on and so on. So this is not a kind of pain to capitalism. What I'm saying is it's actually the practice of competence which has made the world a better and fairer place, with the big caveat that it has to be tempered by virtue. If you're going to look at it through a political lens, capitalists and the kind of, the virtue people have to have a voice, because I think the people who are highly motivated to achieve major stages in success games are often completely sociopathic. They just want to win. And if this is, and if it's going to be like the Elon Musk Bezos game of who gets to go to the moon first or whatever, or who gets to go to Mars first, whatever it is, I just want to win. And those people need the influence of the virtue people in order to ensure that the success games which they're creating are, the rewards are distributed fairly. In the book, I call them kind of success virtue games. I mean, those are the ones where we really win.
Yeah. And we can see the tribe circling the prized hunter and singing a song of derision when Elon Musk or Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg is acting like a selfish prick. The internet is very effective at at singing songs of derision, network. Right? It's the gossip network, and it does trim the sails and reduce status in order to try to encourage more virtuous and more communal behavior in those cases. This brings to mind a quote from John Lennon of the Beatles, who I believe said, "The Beatles stopped being a band when we stopped going into record stores and trying to improve on our favorite singles."
Oh, wow.
So they were kind of no longer playing the status game, right? Because they no longer had the hunger.
That's amazing. I'd never heard that quote. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it just feels really true to me that once I've often puzzled, because I'm a big music person, and it's often puzzled me, like, why are musicians so great in their 20s compared to their 40s? Like Mick Jagger, the Rolling Stones would kill to write another Satisfaction, but why can't they? Why could REM never write Losing My Religion again? And maybe it's that. Maybe it's that they've, when it comes to that enormous global success, that they don't feel that they have to compete anymore. So the drive lessens. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's difficult to achieve any higher status than the Beatles achieved at their peak, right? And I'm sure they saw that. Like, there are no more rungs to climb, right? There's nowhere to go.
Yes.
And unfortunately,
so
the motivation goes with it. And unfortunately, as you point out, and we might also put this in the silver lining category, that to the extent that we common people sit around and pine for what must be the radiant sense of perpetual high status that members of the Beatles or the Elon Musks of the world experience. Unfortunately, as you point out, or perhaps fortunately, we quickly acclimatize to whatever level of status we experience, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I found this actually, it probably reflects badly on me, but I found this to be quite a nice thing to realize, is that because you spend, I mean, it was interesting. You were just talking about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. We're used to thinking of them as, oh, they're so rich, they're so powerful, this kind of envy tinged stuff. But they are also amongst the most ridiculed humans on Earth in the Western world.
True.
Yeah. So we acclimatize to the status that we have. So we quickly get used to it. The brain is very good at saying, well, actually, yes, I do deserve this status that's kind of coming my way. And then we want more, and we want more, and we want more of it. So what that means is that those people at the very top, like I'm a middle-list author. I'm drowning in authors who are more successful than me.
You're very accomplished, Will. I'm not going to let you off that easily. You're a highly accomplished and respected author, but I'm sure you can find others who've sold more books for sure.
It's turning into therapy. Thank you, Rufus. But it's also true that even those writers who I look up to and think, oh, if only I could be that successful. Part of my brain thinks they must be so happy. They've got everything that I've ever wanted. Yeah. But of course, it's not true, because they're not competing with me. They're competing with other writers who are also super successful. So they're no more happy, I don't think, in terms of status than, well, maybe they're a bit more happy, but not much more happy than I am, because they're competing on a much higher level. So and that's also true of the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses of the world. They haven't achieved happiness by climbing the scales of status, because they're now competing on a insane level, and it's actually much harder for them to maintain their levels of status than it is for most people.
I was surprised to learn that Ian McEwan, who's one of my favorite novelists, a fellow Brit, and Martin Amis, I think it's also true of, don't read reviews of their books. You'd think, like, if you're one of the most revered novelists in the world, and most of Ian McEwan's reviews are extremely positive, that you could stomach a few negative reviews, right? You've landed at this place. You've got status to spare, but we're all kind of fragile in these ways.
All of us. Yeah. I mean, in the book I wrote about Paul McCartney and that his obsession with the fact that on all the labels on his records it says Lennon McCartney. That's the songwriting credit.
Oh, right.
That,
yes.
Amazing. Why does Lennon come first? He's had multiple attempts at trying to persuade the Beatles and the remaining Beatles and Yoko Ono to allow him to be McCartney Lennon on some songs, but he's never got anywhere with it. But that was amazing to me because, as you said, you can't imagine a bunch of people who've had more status in the 20th century than the Beatles, and yet Paul McCartney is still stressing about this silly thing that nobody but him thinks about.
So I wonder now what we can learn as individuals from all that we've discussed today. I was very moved by some comments you had toward the end of the book about the power of warmth, sincerity, and competence. How do you think about how we can best apply this to our lives?
I think there's a small handful of releases. I think one of the big things in the book was beware the virtue game, and I think that's especially important in Western cultures at the moment. I think there, especially since the end of the financial crisis, we've seen a resurgence in the virtue game and people behaving on all sides, behaving quite appallingly because they're so possessed with their local idea of what virtue is. So I think beware the virtue game is a big one. Warmth, sincerity, and competence was this, there's a really interesting body of work by psychologists looking into what they call impression management, which sounds a bit Machiavellian. It's, like how can we manage the impression that we make on other people? But I was interested in that work because it tallied quite well with what I was, the theory that I'd been putting forward in the status game, which is about these 3 games of dominance, virtue, and success. Some researchers talk about these 3 different components of presentation and the warmth, so sincerity, and competence. So when we appear warm, sincere, and competent, people are just going to like us, and that maps onto those 3 games. So I think when you present with warmth, you're signaling to people, I'm not going to be dominant. I'm not going to push you around. When we signal sincerity, we say, we're going to play a good virtue game with you. So I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to be honest with you. If I'm unhappy, I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to, play a bad virtue game. And, competence, when we show competence, we tend to signal that we're going to be valuable to the group that we're in, and people want that because then their group's going to benefit. So it felt to me like this kind of magic triumvirate, really: warmth, sincerity, and competence. And it really is hard to imagine meeting somebody who was warm, sincere, and competent and not thinking they're amazing. I think I'd really like that person. So it just felt like just an interesting target for us to kind of aim ourselves towards. Probably an impossible target to aim ourselves towards, a lot of the time, but an interesting target. And the final sort of big takeaway for me was just this idea, status is more important to people than money. Most people, we want to feel valued and respected. Yeah. And the amazing thing about it is it's free, and we've got unlimited stores of it to give away to people. And actually, I feel like, because we're chippy about status and because status is relative, we can often be quite miserly in the status that we give other people. And just the revelation to me that we have this resource that people love, and we can just give it to anyone that we want. I mean, with the caveat, of course, that you've got to be sincere about it. You can't be telling everybody they're amazing and you love them, unless you're in LA and have people believe it. You've got to be sincere with it. But that's changed the way that I behave in the world. I'm much more kind of generous with telling people that I value them than I used to be. And guess what? People love it.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. So you feel this in just interpersonal interactions with people, right? And also it can help us be aware of these things, that actually people talk about the power of listening, right? But a lot of this is about that eye contact, that communication of I value what you have to say. And I also think that this bleeds into some of the political polarity that we've been experiencing. That it's always struck me that at least in the U.S., that part of the challenge has been a collapse of dignity of a community of people whose jobs are becoming less important in the changing world. And you can't just throw money at that. If people are experiencing a collapse of dignity and value and status, writing checks does not solve that problem. No. And so that does feel like a pretty important core insight. And also, I think we see the dangers of the virtue game on both sides of the political aisle, right? In the world today. I was fascinated by your comment that actually what we see is disagreements between the new right and the new left in America about how the status game is rigged. I think you said that the new right sees the world as unfairly dominated by educated people. Yep. And the new left sees the world as unfairly dominated by straight white men.
Yeah, so they both have these different experiences of how the status game is unfairly rigged, and that's why they clash. So fundamentally, that what I've called in the book the new right is this kind of very kind of loose collection of kind of populist right wing people in the US and the UK. They're basically saying, look, it's a highly educated elite that has taken over the media, the government, and so on, and we're sick of it. And we're not going to have it. You're imposing your ideas on us, and we don't want them. And the new left are saying that the game is rigged unfairly by straight white men, and we're sick of it, and all the ideas that you're imposing on us.
Right.
So that we were talking before about how. We experience life as a story, and the story that we experience is the one that flatters our own beliefs and our sense of kind of status and in a kind of heroism. And I think both of those sides sincerely believe the world like that, even though the reality is far more complicated than either of those kind of simplistic stories would have you believe.
That's right. And the brain is a storytelling machine in which we are the heroes. And if we take a step back and appreciate that and go a little lighter on our virtue games on the internet and elsewhere and in our lives, and try to treat everyone with a higher degree of dignity and find ways to help everybody feel a sense of status and self-worth. And an interesting part of that story might be that with the rise of national media, if you think that we all lived in these towns or small cities or what have you, where we had a sense of our role in a community, and we compared ourselves when we played the status game, we compared ourselves to the other people in our small town. But all of a sudden, with television being pumped into your home and flashy people in Los Angeles on your screen, the status game has been recontextualized on a national or global scale, and one has been demoted, right?
Yeah, completely. And I think that's one of the reasons why people in modern Western developed countries are often so unhappy and stressed out and anxious, because our status games are much too big now. We evolved to play status games in the context of small groups. So in the groups in which we evolved, say you play in success games, those would tended to be split by gender. So men would compete with men and women compete with women. Then within that separation, there'd be age. So, young kids wouldn't be competing with old men and so on. And then there's different competencies. So who's the best hunter? Who's the best tuber finder? Who's the best storyteller and so on? So these are very small status games. And so relatively very easy to feel like, relatively speaking, you're doing pretty well. But these days, in this sort of globalized context, we're playing status games with thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. If you work for Apple or Walmart or Tesco's, you're playing this enormously kind of extended status game. So it's another reason why the status that's on offer is massively diluted, and so the subconscious brain, the brain which evolved to play status game in small communities, is feeling like we're failing. I mean, it's part of the modern condition, isn't it? That we can feel like we're failing, even when we're paying our mortgage, putting food on the table. Our survival capacities are perfectly fine and not under threat, but we can still feel, and often do feel, like we're failing. And I think that's because our status games have become, unnaturally large. And when they're unnaturally large, they're hard to feel like we're doing well inside.
And I also love this kind of advice that we should diversify our sources of status, right? That we should, that I think you're, in addition to writing books, you're now riding bicycles, right? And it behooves us, much as we have diversified stock portfolios, it behooves us to have diversified ego investments in multiple status games, not just one.
That's right. I mean, and the scientific literature finds that people with, they could say complex multiple self-identities tend to be happier and healthier and have more stable emotional lives. And I think that's because they've got multiple sources of status. I mean, it's indicated. I about a year ago I got a bike, and it was amazing. As soon as I got the app that showed you how far you'd gone, how what your heart rate had done, and as soon as it put a number to your bike rides, I suddenly became much more motivated to cycle, because you start competing against yourself. Yeah, and it's been really good for me, just that simple thing of starting to, get out and ride a bike, because it's something else I can think about, something else I can get excited about, another source of meaning, another source of status.
Well, I'm doing the same thing with the bike riding, although I'm not sure how I elevate my status comparing it to myself. But I do something that's worked out well for me, Will, which is I play squash with only one other person, and I tend to win slightly more often than he does. So I live in a universe in which there are two squash players, and I'm the world champion.
I love
and it really is great.
Scam. Nice one, Rufus. That's great.
Yes. I've fixed the status game on the squash board. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Such a fascinating conversation, and we can't wait for your next book. And any clue as to what that might be?
Not right now. I'm kind of fishing around at the moment, but I will let you know, Rufus. And thanks for having me on. It's been a really deep and interesting talk, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
So, Caleb, what did you think?
I loved it. I loved it. I think the highest compliment I can give that conversation is that it actually helped me get to know myself a little bit better.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'll give you an example, right? So I live in LA, as you know, and this is a city that is just completely awash with status symbols. And one of the biggest is what kind of car you drive. And I drive a 2015 Honda Fit, which is basically like, if you picture the fanciest car you can, this is the opposite. So I am definitely losing the car status game. And to be perfectly honest, there are times where I'm kind of embarrassed about that. Like, I will go to meet someone and I'll park around the block because I don't want them to see how lame my car is. I'm not kidding. And then, funny. Of course, immediately I feel bad, right? I'm like, oh God, Caleb, you're so shallow. You're so materialistic. No one actually cares about you that much. They're not judging you. Then there are also times where I will brag about having such a lame car because it seems kind of cool and contrarian, right? It's like, oh, I'm above being part of that car status game. I don't care about the vehicular hierarchy, And then the voice in my head is like, you're lying, Caleb. Like, you would love to be showing up to this in the brand new Tesla. So it's just this kind of lose-lose situation. But after hearing you and Will talk, it's allowed me to sort of zoom out and say, look, this is bigger than you. You're caught in a status game. There are tremendous cultural and evolutionary, biological forces pushing on you here, pressing on you. And, I haven't yet quit the car status game. I haven't opted out, and maybe I never will be able to. But I definitely now have the sort of tools or the awareness to be a little bit more compassionate to myself and to realize, like, okay, this isn't just about being shallow. There's actually a lot more at work under the hood here, to make a cheesy pun. So anyway, so that's my story. What about you? What are your takeaways, Rufus?
Well, my first takeaway is that I'm feeling a lot of compassion towards you, Caleb, with your Honda Fit and losing the car status game. That really sounds character building. It actually segues nicely to one of my big takeaways, which is I was fascinated by this point Will makes that no one wins the status game. But the closest you can get to winning, the best outcome you can generate is to have gradually climbing status throughout your life. So basically starting with the Honda Fit was a great choice, Caleb. Nowhere to go but up.
Yeah, I think that suggests that Joe Biden maybe has actually won the status game, right? Like, talk about gradually climbing status.
Yes, totally. He's nailed it. He's getting to the apex in the very last moments. Well done, Joe.
How do you feel, Rufus, that you're doing on the kind of Biden curve?
I feel pretty good about not having achieved too much status too early. I'm feeling good about my incremental status growth plan.
Yeah. Maybe it was good you weren't publishing those books like your friends were in your 20s,
Exactly.
Right?
I know. Publishing first book in my mid to late 50s, I think, is exactly the right plan.
One more thing maybe before we go. I wonder if there are any book bites that you've listened to recently that you think listeners who enjoyed this episode might enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. So a quick refresher. Book bites are what we call the book summaries that you can find only on the Next Big Idea app. These summaries are produced by the authors themselves. They take 12 minutes to listen to or 4 minutes to read. One that feels related to this episode is the book bite Arthur C. Brooks made for From Strength to Strength. It's about finding ways to say, I'm not going to play that status game anymore. Really a wonderful book bite.
Yeah.
Another one I love is Anna Lemke's book bite for Dopamine Nation, where she kind of suggests that the reason the status games we play on social media are so dangerous is that when we get a lot of Instagram likes or retweets, it doesn't just elevate our status. It gives us a massive dopamine hit that can easily become addictive, and partly because the effect is so temporary and it's fundamentally unsatisfying.
Yeah, that's a really good one. There are a lot of overlaps there. Another one that I would throw out is the book bite that Oliver Burkeman made for 4,000 Weeks.
Yeah.
And that's this book where the idea is that he says, look, the average human lifespan is only about 4,000 weeks long, and that is just simply not long enough for you to compete in and win every status game. So you've got to figure out what truly matters to you and pare back and let the rest fall away and realize you can't achieve it all, you can't win it all. I think that's a really key message here.
Such a great book bite, 4,000 Weeks. Love it.
As you mentioned before, if you want to listen to these book bites, there's hundreds of them now. All you have to do is go to your app store, download the Next Big Idea. There's no better way to get smart fast, as we like to say. So download the Next Big Idea app today.
This episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger.
That's me.
Our executive producer is Michael Kovnat. Sound designed by Mike Toda. We feel like we won the status game by partnering with the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.